Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. First, I would like to say thank you to Jennifer Woodside and Phoebe Moore from Alumni Relations and University Advancement for inviting us to speak and coordinating this webinar. I'm Jennifer Borda. I am a professor in the communication department here at UNH and also the co-founder and co-director of the UNH Civil Discourse Lab. My scholarship here illuminates advocacy, social movements, and civic rhetoric, and the potential to shape social change in local communities, as well as to create opportunities for deliberation about public issues. Here at UNH, I've been teaching for 20 years, and I teach classes such as propaganda and persuasion, communication and deliberation across differences, gendered rhetorics, and a class on social protest. 4 years ago, I launched the Civil Discourse Lab, which we refer to as the CDL, with my communication colleague, Professor Renee Heath. The CDL integrates research, engaged teaching, and community praxis in order to strengthen the ability of our students and community members to conduct meaningful conversations, collaborate, and make decisions about important but sometimes difficult topics to speak about, but that matter to a civil society. So the CDL trains students to become neutral facilitators of challenging and contentious discussions, using small groups to focus participants on conversations that elevate our fundamental differences as well as our shared values, while emphasizing listening and empathy in order to encourage greater understanding. We believe that these skills are needed in our American democracy more than ever. So now I would like to introduce Professor Renee Heath.
Hi. As Jen said, I am the co-director of the Civil Discourse Lab and have come to the topic of navigating difficult conversations with a pretty long history as well. I started in nonprofit work and local government work, where I became very interested as a practitioner in the ways that communities made decisions across organizations collaboratively and with the egalitarian spirit of sharing power. That when I came back to academia, those are the things that I studied. So I've been studying collaborative decision-making across sectors for about 20 years. That also led to an interest in these other public dialogue processes, and have had as well some deep training, and have made the foundation of my teaching and learning around different methodologies, such as appreciative inquiry, which may be familiar to some because it's also an organizational development method, the 21st century town meeting, which is used to include the public in public decision-making, as well as Professor Board and I have spent a lot of time with the Kettering Institute learning national issues, forums, methodologies for public discourse and public deliberation. Those have led to not only research and writing and teaching about that, but specific course development that we have complemented the lab with. And I teach the public dialogue and deliberation course, as well as a course on collaborative leadership. So I will turn it to Jonathan to introduce a student who has taken classes from both of us.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Goldberg. I'm a senior communication major. I've been with the lab since the fall of 2019. And I've taken a few courses, such as what Renee Heath just said there, the public dialogue class. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to move into sharing my presentation, and just to give a quick overview, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that Professor Heath and I have done and published recently about civility and discursive openings, and then we will move into Professor Heath speaking about alumni impact study we've done with the Civil Discourse Lab, and talk a little bit about what our students have done with the lab and how they've connected that to their professional lives. And then Jonathan will talk a little bit about his experience with the CDL. So according to Emily Shumley Wright, President and CEO of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, if the American experiment is to succeed, we must improve the quality of our conversations, our political, academic, and civic conversations. Ultimately, our inability to engage in civil and productive conversations means losing our ability to see one another as partners in the self-governance project, putting the future success of American democracy in doubt. So I wanted to open with that quote because I think that shows, oh, sorry, I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint. That gives an opening to the way that we've been thinking about civility within a democratic context and the way that we think about the role of conversations. So it is in this democratic context that we offer a redefinition of civil conversation as an opportunity to expand our thinking about how to navigate difficult conversations in our local communities, our workplaces, and in our interpersonal relationships. From our framework as communication scholars, we are interested in theorizing ways to improve dialogue or the way we engage others through communication processes and across differences. Dialogue through conversation can connect people with different opinions and promote understanding. Dialogue among a small group also can educate people and illuminate a better understanding of complex issues. Today, we will translate some of that more formal theorizing about dialogue and public deliberation into takeaways that you can apply to your everyday interactions that can help you to navigate difficult conversations and to improve your communication with others across differences. So philosopher John Dewey wrote in Democracy and Education, "We live in a community in virtue of the things which we have in common, and communication is the way in which we come to possess things in common. What we must have in common in order to form a community or society are aims, beliefs, aspirations, and knowledge, a common understanding, like-mindedness, as the sociologists say." So here, Dewey is theorizing democracy as a commitment to keeping the conversation going. Yet we live in a large and diverse society. It often feels like we've lost the ability to find commonality, that like-mindedness has sometimes been overcome by our intense polarization and division. However, some believe that the point of our democracy is not to land on a universal idea or an everlasting set of American beliefs and values that will forever govern our actions, but rather to welcome in communication that continually negotiates what we hold in common and cultivates our common understanding in the new contexts and situations we find ourselves in as our democracy, our nation, and our communities continue to evolve. So now the question becomes, how do we work to keep the conversation open? Through preparation and a commitment to these conversations, we allow for pluralism, dissent, and contestation of our own perspectives and practices as we strive to create a better, more equal, and equitable society. So to foster such common understanding and keep the conversation of democracy going, we need to think about how to create the conditions for a productive conversation. How do we motivate participants to willingly enter into an exchange of ideas in which they embrace vulnerability in sharing their own positions, and in which they practice empathy in hearing out the perspectives of others? So this brings me to another important term to revisit, and one that we have reimagined through our work, which is civility. When Dr. Heath and I conceived of the Civil Discourse Lab, we knew all too well the critiques of civility. Civility has been used too often to silence those who have not had access or voice in a democratic society. Civility has been used to oppress the vulnerable. We tend to deem uncivil that which inconveniences us, such as an encampment of protesters, or even the homeless who sleep on our public sidewalks, or those actions that do not adhere to our own value system. We know that ideas associated with civility, such as respect and dignity, are required to allow us to hear one another and ultimately to allow us to make decisions together in a civil society. However, social movement scholarship tells us that when power is unequally distributed, different forms of communication are necessary to level the playing field. Sometimes what is needed is protest and acts of collective or organized resistance. These are legitimate forms of communication in a pluralistic democratic society. Yet the language and value of civility or insistence on decorum is co-opted so easily to vilify, divide, and undermine those with whom we disagree. So the primary context of our work is rethinking how civility might open up conversation as long as conflict and disagreement takes place in contexts where equality and equity can flourish. In the midst of polarization often linked to incivility or a call-out culture, Professor Heath and I sought to reimagine the work of civility as what is needed to promote constructive conflict, rather than being used to suppress conflict altogether. We ask, what work is the conversation doing? We need communication mechanisms that allow us to challenge, to question, and to disagree so that we may have difficult conversations in order to make better decisions and policies together. The most important question then is not, was the conversation civil, but will the conversation continue? So how do we start a conversation that we hope will continue? We have a few ideas. First, we need to contemplate language matters, or how language comes to matter. How we talk about problems matters, and also frames how we ultimately make decisions on those issues. We need to bring forth contested language particular to issues and identities and allow participants in conversation to determine the meaning of language together. So what this means is that the words we use, how we choose to employ language, they're in our own interactions, do work beyond the mere transmission of messages and meanings. They construct the world in which we live, the cultures we inhabit, the relationships we experience, and the social orders that structure power in society. So to ensure an authentic experience that moves beyond slogans or getting hung up on politically incorrect phrases or politically correct phrases, we must acknowledge that the meaning of language is negotiated among participants in a conversation. For example, if you have a coworker, a supervisor, or perhaps even a family member that uses language that makes you feel uncomfortable, that feels insensitive or dismissive or condescending to you and your experiences, or perhaps you've recognized that reaction in others, calling attention to language does not amount to censorship, but instead fosters perspective taking and can be an approach to more productively discussing complex and often divisive topics. So calling attention to the language we use, we argue, opens up dialogue to multiple perspectives and greater understanding, while emphasizing the words we use rather than the people who use them. Second, we need to make a commitment to calling in people while calling out language and ideas that may be seen as divisive or unproductive in moving a conversation forward. Instead of letting our perceived differences act as hurdles to overcome, we should make the work of coming to understand one another in the face of those differences where we begin the conversation. Calling in, we argue, foregrounds at a minimum, mutuality, patience, respect, and tolerance as a path forward when dealing with perspectives that we don't understand. In our research, we discovered the work of activist Ngoc Loan Tran, whose words on this subject are elegant. We have to let go of treating each other like not knowing, making mistakes, and saying the wrong thing make it impossible for us to ever do the right things. There are infinitely many more things we have yet to know and may never know. We have to let go of a politics of disposability. We are what we've got. Tran suggests that calling in also demands humility, and they write, we have to remind ourselves that we once didn't know. Calling in, paired with explicit conversation to language, nurtures the communication environment needed to engage in conversation with respect for others. Emily Shamley Wright, who I mentioned earlier, also argues good conversations allow us to manage our affairs with others peacefully. Better still, they leave us with the sense that something new has been created or discovered. They leave us feeling challenged and curious in ways that lead to new conversations. Ultimately, all good conversations are about connection in which one mind meets another. One way to invite new connections and foster curiosity is sharing personal stories. And this is something that we invite in the public deliberations that we design and coordinate with the Civil Discourse Lab. This sharing of stories cultivates identification by recognizing others' experiences as valid on their own terms, even when we may disagree about their position on an issue. Seeing an issue through the eyes of another person, especially someone of a different culture or background, can be a powerfully affecting experience, which brings me to my last point. Discursive openings also introduce gracious contestation into the conversation through ground rules that prepare participants for earnest disagreement. Grace, at its etymological root, implies mercy and forgiveness. Yet, we argue that contestation is what is necessary to challenge power dynamics and inequity. Gracious contestation invites conflict in the conversation by calling out ideas, language, and practices, while maintaining earnestness and humility in cultivating relationships. This is a calling out that is approached with mutual respect, perspective taking, and authenticity. And so goodwill can actually be built into the conversation through ground rules that are determined in cooperation with one another, so that participants have the grace to call in and allow for mistakes or missteps. Some examples of ground rules that the CDL employs include every voice and experience are valid, maintain confidentiality, listen to understand, avoid interrupting, focus on the issue, not the person, and avoid generalizing. These ground rules may be revised based on the needs of the situation and the context in which the participants enter into the discussion. Difficult conversations with a supervisor or a coworker would require different ground rules than discussions between spouses, romantic partners, or a parent-child relationship. So moving from a notion of debate or showing that you have the upper hand or trying to win the argument because you know you're right and you can drop a bunch of knowledge about the subject, to a space of dialogue and understanding is vitally important for creating a sense of goodwill and working to find what we hold in common, while also identifying areas of disagreement and difference. Civility, then, we argue, is a way of opening conversation in a way that allows us to communicate with others about controversial topics or issues that are difficult to talk about. We do this by moving the conversation forward through recognizing how and why language matters and determining the meanings of language together, calling out ideas and language that are disruptive or unproductive, inviting productive conflict into the conversation through gracious contestation, determining agreed upon ground rules that will guide our conversations, and moving from a place of debate to a space of dialogue intended for mutual understanding and respectful exchange. We believe that our work and the clear impact it has on students is necessary to sustain our democracy because a good conversation can elevate what we hold in common, foster connections across differences, elicit greater empathy, compassion, and understanding, and inspire advocacy toward advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So I'm now going to turn the talk over to Professor Heath, who will talk about how, with the Civil Discourse Lab, we've seen how this approach to civility, conversation, and discursive openings makes a difference a difference we believe matters to the future and sustainability of our democracy.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to share my screen. So we were thinking that perhaps, given the audience of alumni, you might be interested in hearing a little bit about the connections between what we've been doing in the lab and what it has meant for students that are graduating out of the programs and the curriculum that we've been developing. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're measuring with this study, the impact study that we've done with alumni coming out of the Civil Discourse Lab. I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So when I refer to some of the voices of alum who are I'm going to be sharing, it will make sense. And then we'll talk about the preliminary qualitative themes that we have and the implications of doing this work. So to begin, the question is, what are we measuring? And we are asking alumni what they perceive as impact with their involvement with the Civil Discourse Lab, which, as mentioned, really got going by January 2018, when we started putting on our first co-curricular events. So since January 2018, we've had approximately 136 students who affiliated, meaning they claimed membership, and we allow them to do that as they see fit when they're participating with us. We look specifically at those students who had volunteered their time above and beyond classroom work, at least 10 hours, and who had also identified strongly with perhaps a leadership position or had talked about involvement as it personally related to their identity in the department. This is a qualitative study, so the research is being conducted by our colleague, Dr. Lydia Reinick, who is a postdoctoral research and teaching associate for the Civil Discourse Lab. And she's conducted more than 30 interviews at this point with alumni who mostly have been out on an average about 1 year before we wanted to speak to them to hear how they perceived the impact. And we're looking at courses. When we talk about what's the Civil Discourse Lab, it really has these three prongs. We have courses that we've developed specifically for the lab, collaborative leadership, communication across differences, and deliberation across differences, public dialogue and deliberation are courses that correlate very specifically with the mission of the lab. And several of these courses that we've developed have an out of classroom component to them, where we are hosting large scale public dialogue events. And that would be the co-curricular piece. We also have out of the classroom work where folks come to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about that before I launch into some of the findings. I was so excited to find this graphic because so often people associate what we're doing in the Civil Discourse Lab only with this top part, which is facilitation. And we really view that as a very superficial part of it, because that would just be training. And we go much deeper than that. Well, facilitation is absolutely an important vehicle that our students participate in as they put on these large events and then facilitate the conversations at these tables of 10 or so. As Jen went through some of the curriculum already, we're really talking about much deeper things, and I'm not going to touch on all of these, but the differences between dialogue, deliberation, debate, collaboration, they mean very different things. We get into stakeholder theory. Who should be part of these conversations? Where is accountability and creativity going to arise from? What's the role of experts? What's the difference between advocacy, if we were to put on a public event that is about advocacy versus learning, discovery, or understanding? Then we get into granular things, designing events, question construction, listening, but there's a pretty healthy curriculum that supports what eventually manifests in what you see as a facilitated event. And those events look a lot like this poster on the side. So this poster is reflective of our Stories and Voices event, which our students branded the first year we did this in the public dialogue and deliberation course. Dr. Borda's class in the fall is building a complementary program that does co-curricular outside work during the fall, while the Stories and Voices is our spring program. Incidentally, this year will be our 5th annual spring program. And in this, the students are doing the out of classroom work, which is really interviewing folks in the community, event design. They're producing materials such as nonpartisan programs and doing a lot of research on the topics for which we are facilitating conversations. And then lots of nuts and bolts, logistics, marketing, interfaces with technologies, from invitation technologies like Eventbrite to polling technologies, interfacing with printing and catering, et cetera. So eventually we execute and facilitate between 50 and 100 person at these events, and then the debrief becomes a very important part of it. So there's in and out of the classroom work. The final piece, I won't spend too much time on it, but I just want you to be aware that there are different vendors, for lack of a better word, who have come to us either in the university or outside of the university, such as 3S Art Space in Portsmouth, where we've been asked to help with question design, to bring volunteer facilitators to help them navigate difficult conversations. And that has been another thing that our students do and that they volunteer their time for. So to get to the meat of what I wanted to share with you today, because this is an ongoing study, these are preliminary findings. And right now we're seeing findings cluster around three specific areas that I wanted to share a little bit about today. And those areas are leadership and job skills, life and relational skills, and then just briefly, I won't get into the pedagogy of teaching it, but we're learning a little bit about what works in terms of the design of the lab. So leadership and job themes. We're breaking these out right now into two different areas. One being these systems thinking type skills that we're seeing because students have an opportunity to be part of a project that really begins in the classroom and carries out with a culminating event. And as a result, they are understanding and executing project design and project management. They are understanding facilitation and conflict navigation as an ongoing kind of systems way of thinking about problems. They are executing problem solving as a result of planning these events. Stakeholder identification, who should be at these events that will help make these events authentic and legitimate. So kind of big picture leadership skills, as well as technical leadership skills, such as issue framing and question and agenda writing and program materials design and listening. So we see these very complimentary of our alumni who are now in the workforce saying attributing their skills to this experience they had. So I'm going to give you an sampling of some of the research that some of the statements that we're getting from alumni and share with you a few on each, not all of them. But creative project management has come up several times, so it's clustered there. And this is Grace, who graduated in 2019 and is now a trainer in the learning development field. And she recalls project management as being one of the most impactful things where they were allowed to create. And she enjoyed and mentions how important it was that even though the professor's picking the topic, that she let us be creative, which has come in handy with the position I'm in now. So she's creating trainings, she's creating curriculum, and she thinks that project management aspect and the facilitating conversation has been reflected in her work now, whether it's one-on-one with 5 or 10 people. So she sees those skills in her job and attributes those back to being introduced to them with the lab. Another student, Sybil, who's now an alumni, graduated in 2020. She's at a tech learning company. And she said that, again, the process of creating an event and organizing an event. And you'll see the alumni leaning on the stories and voices as a kind of pivotal point in their learning as being beneficial. So they talk about in their job interviews and in their present work situations. In this case, she spoke about the process in every single one of her job interviews and with other career professionals. She leaned heavily on stories and voices, the process of doing research to prepare for it, doing the learning before. She thought all of that was, again, that creates kind of that emphasis on something being an entire system. It gave her what she called legitimate experience without necessarily work experience, but it related. Conflict navigation skills. Hannah is in law school right now, and Hannah talked about having to get a job between years in law school. And specifically, she's looking in family law, children law, and immigration law. And she said, actually, on the application she's submitting, they wanted candidates who were able to have experience in dealing with tougher issues, dealing with difficult things to talk about. And they specifically want people with experience there. So she drew again on her experience with Stories and Voices, which she was a part of both our immigration public event as well as one we did on the stigma of addiction. And she said, I was able then to say I had experience where I was managing conversations that were difficult to talk about. It gave her that real world experience for her law school applications. Problem solving, Garrett, he's in marketing now. And, we got a kick out of his saying that when he was going through the interview process, people said, this is insane. It's so awesome that you have these skills, you can facilitate, you can run an agenda, meeting, dealing with conflict, and they recognized you're a problem solver. And so he said the questions and interviews went beyond, have you ever done this? It was, when did you do this? And he was able to lean on the experience with the lab and say things such as, I was in charge, I was part of a team planning this 100-person dialogue. In addition, we know if we're dealing with difficult conversations that our alumni and our students are gaining skills in empathy, embracing conflict, or embracing discomfort and perspective taking, as well as curiosity. I'm going to talk about just a few of these, but these were a cluster area that alumni talked about as something they gained from their experience with the lab. Conrad is a non-traditional student who came to us after having experience in the military. And he said, the CDL changed how I perceived my entire life. And he admits he came out of military and had not really thought very specifically about left or right, just live your life, get through it. And then he went to the courses and started getting involved as a CDL affiliate. And he said, the courses that were involved in it, just talking to the people was eye-opening to just realizing there is more to it than just surviving yourself and only understanding yourself. Another theme that came up was the alumni reported they were in situations that were uncomfortable and they enjoyed challenging their comfort zones in the environments that we created, because this is something you do the rest of your life. And so we would hear, facilitations, this is Elise, who's now marketing and hiring. Facilitations definitely made me uncomfortable, which was a good thing. They pushed me out of my comfort zone, even though if I felt like it was going to a bunch of, she had prepared, she said, even though I prepared and went in prepared, it was nerve-wracking. So she talked about being able to lead a conversation and how she leans on that in her own job, where now she's doing hiring and she has to interview people, and she has the facilitations in which she was asking folks questions and needed to be able to come up with questions on the spot, had prepared her to do the type of work that she's doing now in the workplace, where she's interviewing and coming up with follow-up questions and such when she's hiring folks. Perspective taking also is a life skill that goes from the workplace to life in general. And Hattie, who's a communication organizer for a grassroots political organization, graduated in 2019. And she says, I think the only way to understand difficult things like other perspectives is to engage them. And that's what we did in the Civil Discourse Lab. And she points out that people don't understand that we might perhaps agree with someone else, or even just be able to humanize them if we take part in those processes. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of the themes that are clustering around pedagogy and teaching that might be interested to this group, so we can get on to the question phase after we hear from Jonathan in a minute. But we are noting themes coming up, such as strong faculty and alumni relations being very important, and increased understanding and interest of major. We have some surprising other things that are happening, like we learned how important our debriefs were in the learning process, which was kind of a funny thing because sometimes we just added those on, but we knew we needed to do them. But students reported that, alumni reported that as being really where the learning took place. And we also have learned that our motivations for getting people there, sometimes through extra credit and others, gets them in the door, but then they stick around, and that has been a more useful tool than we realized to get students to participate. Like this quote from Karen, who's now a recruiting coordinator at Amazon and graduated in 2019. And she was funny because she said it was senior year and she had zero motivation to participate in her classes. She got involved in the public dialogue course, and then she responds, as a student, I look forward to going to it every day. Every reading assigned was relevant to the capstone project that we did with Stories and Voices event. And it just made her senior year really great. So we saw that anecdotally, we thought students were becoming more engaged in our classes and in other areas when they participated in these extracurricular or co-curricular events. And we also see these lasting UNH connections with our alumni. Elise, who we heard from earlier, says it just felt good to be a part of something. And it was the only thing that she really did where she felt fully a part of UNH. And now she recognizes she has that special relationship with professors. And if she wasn't part of the Civil Discourse Lab, she wouldn't be getting emails from us to reunions and to talk to other students. And so she really appreciated being involved. So we know that those lifelong connections are being made through the work of the lab. And this is the final voice that I'll share with you today, but one that I thought was fun to leave on. Sybil, during her interview, when she was asked if she had any questions, responded, well, is there a way that as a postgrad I can get involved with the CDL? I know it's meant for students at the university, but I'd like to get involved if there's any way I can. And we do see our alumni coming back to our events, and so appreciate that they are still connected and now are mentoring students who are going through on their own. So implications quickly, we know that we are preparing students for a 21st century workplace. We feel confident about that. We appreciate that what the work we're doing is increasing and making broader perspectives and tolerance for difference, because that's the world that we live in right now. And we also know that we are building a network of relationships, not just faculty and alumni, but peer-to-peer. Those relationships go beyond. We have students that are working together in the same organizations today, alumni to students, and then of course alumni to faculty. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to a soon-to-be alumni, Jonathan Goldberg, who will share his final closing thoughts about the Civil Discourse Lab and his experience.
Yes, thank you. So, like I said earlier, I've been a part of the Civil Discourse Lab since the fall of 2019. I was first exposed to Lab in my introduction to Civil Discourse class. I was interested in what the Civil Discourse Lab was doing, and I wanted to be a part of their mission to strengthen the ability of students and community members to conduct meaningful conversations. The CDL was a way for me as a student to utilize communication theories that I was learning about in the classroom in a natural research setting. I quickly found myself more involved with the lab, taking more courses surrounding discourse and dialogue, and attending CDL events as much as I could. Being a part of the CDL allowed me to hear from voices of all backgrounds and learn about topics across a huge spectrum. I always find myself, after participating in a CDL event, leaving and continuing to reflect on the conversation I just had. And that's what makes the CDL such an important resource for the entire community. My passion for the lab and their work led me to take on even more responsibility. This year, I became a fellow at the lab, and I've worked closely with Professor Heath, Professor Borda, to continue equipping students in the greater community and having difficult conversations. One of the best experiences I had at the CDL was designing and facilitating a public dialogue for their 2021 Stories and Voices event last semester. In my junior year, I was lucky enough to have Professor Heath in her public dialogue course, where we spent the semester in collaboration with the CDL designing this public dialogue event based on food solutions and the racial equity challenge. To facilitate or even organize a meaningful conversation about a topic as loaded as racial equity, we had to learn and comprehend the distinctions of different types and aims of public discourse and how to best facilitate a conversation crucial to the public sphere. Designing conversations about racial equity especially with a predominantly white student body, is no easy task, which was apparent on day one. We spent hours in and out of the classroom researching both racial equity and also about the theories surrounding facilitating difficult conversations. As the semester continued, we found ourselves equipped with the knowledge and experience to conduct these conversations. It was evident that the more we learned about the importance of difficult conversations and how to have them, the easier the conversations became. During the debrief on the last night of our public dialogue event, I could remember the same students who were nervous about facilitating an actual event were now glowing with confidence. These students are a great representation of what the Civil Discourse Lab strives to achieve. These students came into a classroom unsure of their own ability to have such difficult conversations and left the classroom with a tool belt of communication theories, facilitating experience, and confidence in themselves that will last with them for the rest of their lives. So difficult conversations, whether in the classroom, the workplace, or at your Thanksgiving table, are essential to have, and learning how to have them should be essential to you. So we see some of you have been typing some questions for us, and if you haven't yet, please utilize the Q&A feature to submit one. And with that, Professor Bordo will now open up our Q&A portion of the event.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So we look forward now to continuing this conversation with all of you. So as Jonathan mentioned, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A tool, and I will start reading some of these great questions that have come in, and we'll tag team answer those. So the first question is, do you think the students learning this today at UNH will be better equipped to have challenging conversations? I have hope for the future younger generation, saving us all from these strange times where people can't seem to work things through with each other. So yes, we have been finding, particularly with these 30-some alumni of the CDL that were interviewed by actually some of our CDL student fellows last year, and our postdoctoral research and teaching fellow, Dr. Lydia Reinick, that students are showing that they have utilized this in their interpersonal relationships. One talked about, how he was very much an argumentative person, and he was always looking to find the kind of pathway to kind of win the argument or prove that he knew more than the other person. And particularly in contentious situations, the experience that he had with the CDL let him kind of take a step back, take a deep breath, listen to what the other person was saying, and be able to engage at a slightly different level instead of being combative, to kind of, welcome in a different perspective and really take the time to engage with that perspective. So that's just one of many examples that have come up in our alumni study. Renee, did you want to jump in and add to that? Okay. So the second question is, what do you contribute the lack of civility to these days? Has it always been this bad, but social media and constant news shows amplifies it now? I think, as a student of, the history of social movements and public address, and there have definitely been different periods in our history that have been very divisive. And, as we started this talking about a democratic context, obviously, a democracy is always a work in progress. So there have been times in our nation's history, the Civil War comes to mind, but also other times of social unrest and fights for equality, the 1960s, where I think that there had been a lot of polarization over various civic issues, but we didn't see it as much. So I do think that it's broadcast to us in a different way because of the way that the media functions, and with the media becoming more of an echo chamber, our 24-hour news cycle on cable news channels, the media reporting on what's happening on social media, and social media being, I think we believe, a pretty ineffectual medium a lot of times for conversation, although there are examples that disprove that rule, that is, I think, complicating the landscape quite a bit.
I can add to that and just say that I know that my students most, probably greatest fear that they express often is just not being able to understand information, what's truth or not, or how to measure or understand these things. And I think that is, again, what it refers to what Jen was just talking about. It's part of the landscape of information today and the ways that we receive information, and has definitely lended to our polarization because information is being so carefully selected for us. And that is a primary way that our students are gaining information. So I think the more that we both marry not just the technique of dialogue and civility and conversation, but we're at an educational institution, and both Professor Borden and I spend a lot of time preparing students to understand the different topics from a nonpartisan perspective, where information is grounded in local knowledge as well as scientific knowledge. And it is important that as we make decisions together, we're able to sift through some of the hyperbole and get at what is truth as we make decisions together.
Great, thanks, Renee. Okay, the next one. I'm heading home for Christmas to a very divided family politically. What resources would you look to so I can prep for this visit? I'm at the point where I'm losing respect for people I used to love dearly because their views are so insane. Or should I just wing it? I think that's an excellent question and gets to something that Renee and I have spoken about a lot. There's some literature on just the notion of preparation. And so many people think about preparation as doing your homework, studying up on an issue, preparing yourself for battle. We think about preparation differently in a conversational context. And that means preparing yourself to be open to having that conversation. So some of the ideas that I talked about in the first half of this webinar are part of that preparation. Another part of preparation is setting those ground rules, deciding those together with your conversational partners. It may seem maybe overly formal or also maybe trivial. However, I was just reading an article the other day about someone who, had kind of gone into this rabbit hole of social media and, really drastically changed her perspectives and opinions in a way where her family members found her beliefs somewhat unrecognizable. And the one thing that she really valued was her romantic partner, who was willing to still engage her in conversation, and they set ground rules in order to do so. So I think that that's something that's really important and part of that preparation. And so I say, definitely don't wing it, because that you usually are leading with emotions rather than, leading with this kind of openness. And if the willingness is there to recoup those relationships, the work that we're doing here is very relational. So we think that's extremely important. Then I think the preparation is just to enter with an open mind and with that humility and really, emphasize listening to the other person before you jump in, and maybe you can start with finding some common ground.
I would add genuine curiosity is a term that often comes up in our courses. And this is, when I was an undergrad and post undergrad taking courses on listening. And I remember just like there was something really that felt off when I could guess that someone had just gone through a listening course, because they were staring intently in my eyes and they were nodding and they were paraphrasing this very rote way back to me. And the important thing that kind of got forgot in some of those trainings was that we have to approach each other genuinely. So if you want to have that conversation with your family, with people that you disagree with, first you have to decide, do you want to have this conversation? And if you do, then approaching with this genuine curiosity, like if you think differently than me, I'm actually very curious about that. What's important to you that has you thinking differently about this? And what is it that you believe that? And we know the difference between being interrogated for defensive reasons, and when someone approaches us and we are happy to talk because they seem interested in us. So if that is a conversation you want to have, bringing that sincerity and authenticity into those conversations is a really important piece of it.
So the next two questions are related. So I'm going to address both of those at the same time, actually asking Renee and Jonathan to jump in because they had experience with this in the spring when they were planning the dialogues around the racial equity challenge and food solutions. So the first one, I'm troubled that a class of primary white students might feel that they are capable of understanding racial equity by reading articles. Was there research beyond articles to forums and insights from those directly impacted by the underrepresented? And then also recognizing that UNH is a primarily white institution, what percentage of the student participants were students of color?
Yeah. Jonathan, do you want to start and then I can pick up the strains of that, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure. So definitely more than just reading articles for sure. The event is stories and voices. So learning and hearing stories and hearing about the voices of underrepresented before this actual event was really key to that. And I can say that, while we may have been a primarily white class, it wasn't just all white students. We had some people that were not, and hearing their voice as students and as people in this community in general definitely helps us when it comes to just understanding where they're coming from and designing the event as a whole.
Well, I and my students were primarily white. The partners whom we partnered with in the university were not, and our leaders in racial equity and the curriculum came from them. So we participated in the Racial Equity Challenge, which is a national challenge that is created by people of color who have put this out with the hope that white people will participate and learn from the lessons that they have organized. And so we definitely saw them as the leaders of the content that was coming into the classroom. And we also participated with them in national trainings where my students were in groups with people that didn't just look like them or had the same experience as them in the training leading up to facilitating dialogues. And we do that as often as we can. Our percentages is a good question. I think our percentages reflect our percentage of student bodies. What percentage our student body is at the university. It's very low. Often we have 1 or 2 or 3 people in a class of 12 to 15 people who might identify as people of color. At the same time, we don't want that to keep us from having important conversations, and we would never try to speak for someone else's experience. And those are part of the very deep lessons that we're learning when we begin to even think about embarking in an area that we do not have local knowledge or experience. And that humility is a part of the lesson, and that recognition that there's so much that we cannot know or cannot experience in the same way that that people of color have, and yet it's their voices that we're trying to bring into the classroom and into the dialogue experiences so that we can broaden those perspectives and work towards a more equitable place to live.
Yeah, and I would just follow up on that as well, because, we look for opportunities in order to, open up opportunities for perspective taking across differences, and also to kind of surfaces the differences that we have. So my communication and deliberation across differences seminar is a small capstone seminar for communication majors. So, we typically have between 12 and 15 students in the class. And this semester, in a class of 12 students, we had racial diversity, but we also had diversity and difference that wouldn't have been visible if someone had just walked into the classroom. So over the course of the semester, I learned that, we had a student from Canada, we had another student who was from Sweden, we had a student who had grown up on military bases in different parts of the world, and whose father, who's an American veteran, was still stationed abroad in Italy. And he became one of the stakeholder interviews that my students did for a forum that we did about voting in the United States and voting, how should we secure our free and fair elections was the topic. We also had another student whose relatives that were of particular ethnicity after 9/11 had been kind of harassed. And so those conversations, I think, are very rich, and those can happen in a classroom as long as you're making conversation the basis of the learning across the semester. And so I think that alone becomes very valuable to students to be having a conversation about some of these difficult issues as part of the classroom curriculum. So another question that came in is, how are UNH students being prepared to address the political divide and improving discourse in a time of intentional disinformation? And so I can speak to this. I've started doing this in my introductory class, which is not a class directly affiliated with the Civil Discourse Lab, but it's called Propaganda and Persuasion. And so my students are learning propaganda, what I'm calling propaganda literacy, and learning how to use research guides that are excellent librarians have put together in order to discern misinformation and fake news. We also look at how public relations and advertising and corporations have manufactured doubt and spread that around particular issues through, not just advertising and the news, but through social media as well. However, in my communication and deliberation class, they start off with what I call perspective taking in, kind of more academic paper form, where they write a point of view paper on the issue that we'll be tackling that semester. And then they have to write an opposing point of view paper. So not asking them to take on that opposing point of view because they've already authentically stated their position, but they have to find information and research that would represent at least two to three alternate views on that topic. And sometimes when they're engaging with those different views, it starts to unsettle what they thought was settled ground in terms of their own perspective. And that can be an uncomfortable and disjarring experience for them. So I feel like that is a great learning opportunity that we start off with in my course, in my capstone seminar, and then they build off of those papers. They have an exercise that they do with a partner in class where they examine those papers. They read each other's point of view and opposing point of view papers and kind of talk through that. And then they start to see what kinds of values, things like valuing innovation and progress, or valuing freedom, or valuing equity or equality, are kind of surfaced in some of those positions. So that's how we do some of that work. We hosted an event 2 years ago of students at the university that were from different political organizations here. The College Dems, College Republicans, and so forth had asked for an event specifically to get together to talk about issues. So we planned and designed and coordinated an event in order to facilitate those discussions. Another question, what have you found as the major personal characteristics that prevent individuals from being constructively engaged, and what effective techniques have you uncovered to enable civil dialogue? So that's a thorny one.
And it's with a minute left.
Yeah.
I think we try to stay away from the area of personal characteristics and try to locate the work in the processes. And yes, sure, some of us, myself included, big Italian family, conflict is normalized in my family, and we like to speak loud and yell about things sometimes. So in many ways, those might be those personal characteristics that we're not as inclined to engage in a conversation without some training. But we wouldn't be doing what we did if we didn't believe that we can construct the conditions, the environment that helps us have better conversations, as well as teach people, certain words. You know these. Let's start with I instead of you. And, what is language that can help us start off on the same page? So we spend a lot of time thinking about that, but we would locate it in the realm of possibility. And that is that we think we can, even those of us who have more fiery ways of approaching the world, can learn how to engage one another in a way that allows for both partners to share what they know and feel, and perhaps learn something from each other.
Great. So our moderators have given us permission to go over just a minute. I do want to acknowledge that we can answer some of these questions, and they would be posted, I believe, through the Alumni Connections follow-up email. But quickly, there were a couple questions about whether we offer workshops off campus, particularly at a manufacturing facility, or spreading the work into our communities. And so, we're kind of in a position of transition with the CDL right now. We're kind of figuring out how to be able to build out our infrastructure in a sustainable way. And also, coming off of the pandemic, we had to pivot to online all of last year. And so we're just now starting to do the in-person events again safely. So it's definitely something that we're interested in, to do what we can to engage the community and also give our wonderful students an opportunity to do more of that as well. So we welcome more questions, and I think that there may be an opportunity to submit those on the website after. So thank you so much to Renee and Jonathan, and also to Jen and Phoebe for putting this together. And we welcome hearing more from all of you.